Hello. My topic is looking at spent fuel, and around the world at the moment we have tens of thousands of tons of spent fuel sitting, being stored, awaiting a final disposal. And we've been doing that for many decades. So technically we may have a done deal. But I want to suggest to you today that there are some challenges remaining in how we manage those fuel stocks, and to show some research that's addressing the questions that I think that are still out there. So if I go back to the beginning, what of nuclear fuel and where spent fuel comes from, we make nuclear fuel, as you can see there, we put it in a reactor and we irradiate it, and the waste product, one of the main waste products from that, is the fuel itself, which contains all the irradiated fission products that come from in the reactor. And over time, we keep the fuel in the reactors until all the useful energy has been squeezed out of it, and then we put it in the fuel ponds, where we get rid of the heat that remains within the fuel and protect people from the radiation. In the UK, what we do after that is, for many years, we've moved it across to Sellafield, where we store it for a little bit longer, and then take it to our reprocessing plants, where we separate out the useful things for new fuel, and we concentrate the waste products and store them in a different plant from that, but something very similar, awaiting final disposal. We're going to change our way of managing fuel to one of storing fuel until we get to disposal. And that's something that's currently done around the world, and we can do it by using bigger ponds situated either centrally within a country or at reactor sites. Or we can dry the fuel, put it in a welded canister, put that in some form of shielding, and allow air to convect around the outside of that to prevent the fuel from overheating, and we can store it in those sorts of containers and structures until we're ready to dispose of it, the fuel. The question is, how long do we have to store it for? And we have lots of designs for disposal systems. Around the world, we have a number of countries who have sites or intent sites identified. But the progress on actually delivering an operational disposal facility that will take spent fuel is very slow, and it will be 20 or 30 years more before we get there. So that's one thing that determines how long we have to store fuel for. The second one is, how long do we have to store the fuel before it's cold enough to go into the repository? And the answer to that question varies depending on how hard you've worked your fuel in the reactor and what the design of your repository system is. But it could be as much as 100 years. And that means that we will be storing fuel for a long time whilst it's been generating, and then when we finish generating power, generating money to pay for the storage and disposal, we'll have to store it for what could be 2 generations of workers before we come to dispose of it. And during this time, spent fuel has no value to us. And I think the challenge is that culturally, as a society, we're not very good at managing things that have no value over very long times. We can do it because we have done it, but we need to pay a lot of attention. And I think spent fuel storage is a matter of public confidence. We have to convince people we can manage this for 100 years responsibly and safely, and then dispose of it. So I think to maintain confidence, we need to maintain our safety margins. We have a good safety record at the moment. We must maintain those. We must be able to demonstrate to people that not only do we understand what's happening, but the fuel and the storage systems are in the state that we say they are. And I think we need to reduce the cost of doing those activities, because the cheaper it is, the less likely it is somebody's going to do the wrong thing, if it's easier to do the right thing. So those, I think, are the challenges we face. So some examples of what we're doing. In terms of the safety margin, here's an example of some fuel we looked at recently for Sellafield. This is fuel that's been in storage for 25 years. And we've been looking at it to say, does it look like we expect it? Yes, it does. And also to look for any evidence that suggests we might have missed something. We're also doing research that says, what if something were to go wrong, what would happen? So that we know what might happen if it goes wrong. And in this case, we've been looking at what does irradiated fuel look like? What's the cracking pattern within the fuel? Because that's important if we want to get water out of the fuel, to dry it before we dispose of it, we need to know how that water is going to flow. So that's starting to look at what would happen if something goes wrong. And the third aspect is looking at if something goes wrong on the plant whilst it's in storage, what would happen to the fuel? How bad could it be? And what is our margin to safety? And this is some simple experiments that have been done by Lancaster University, who we've been working with, to look at what happens if the chemistry of the water changes, what happens if the temperature changes, how will that affect our corrosion of the fuel, and do we have a problem? In terms of monitoring, this is an area where I think the challenge is much greater because we haven't been thinking so long about how we monitor fuel in storage. So this is an example using the lasers that have been mentioned before, and here what we're doing is we're trying to measure the composition of gas inside a fuel storage container, because using that we can tell whether the fuel is intact or not, we can tell whether we've dried the fuel or not, and by looking at different compositions of the gas we can tell whether we're getting gas from the atmosphere into our container or not. So we can provide confirmation that the fuel's intact, that it's dry, and that the container is in the condition we expect it to be in. And if any of those things cease to be true, we know and we can act before something worse happens. Another example of monitoring, this is a technology we're trialing to see if we can put something into those dry storage systems that I mentioned earlier, to monitor for the conditions under which a thing called stress corrosion cracking could occur. The storage systems themselves are initially hot enough that we don't have a corrosion problem, but over time they cool down and eventually they get into a state where the conditions might be such that corrosion could occur. So here's a monitor that we're trying to develop to give us a warning that we have that condition now and we need to start to inspect maybe more frequently. And also provides earlier confirmation that we're not in that region. Finally, we're doing work to look at, can we reduce the cost of storage? We've been looking at, can we retrofit passive cooling into plants that have active cooling in it to reduce the long-term operation and maintenance cost? And we're doing some work at the moment looking at how can we use the nuclear fuel as a battery to provide enough power that we can power monitoring equipment. So we don't have to supply power to our monitors, and we don't have to supply redundant power to our monitors that are important to safety. We can use distributed systems on fuel. So in summary, we have the means to store fuel safely. What we're working on now is to demonstrate that they are safe and the systems are as we think. We want to do that in better, cleverer ways so we can reduce the cost of storage, and that we can therefore maintain public confidence in that part of the nuclear cycle and therefore support the industry as a whole. Thank you very much.